The leather whip cracked across Sarah Mitchell's shoulders before she even understood what was happening, and the sound of her own scream startled her more than the pain did. She fell into the dust of Cedar Ridge's main street, her hands scraping against gravel, while the men who had dragged her from her wagon stood laughing above her. Her husband had been dead 3 weeks. She had buried him herself, with the help of her 12-year-old son, because no one else in town would spare the time. Now the men who claimed her husband owed them money had come to collect what they said was rightfully theirs, and since there was no money left to take, they decided her body would pay the debt instead. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in justice finding its way to those who need it most, take a moment right now to like this video, drop a comment below, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Golden Outlaw Tales so you never miss a story like this one. Sarah had married young, back when Cedar Ridge was still growing into itself, full of promise and dust and dreams. Her husband, Thomas, had been a good man but a poor gambler, and though she never knew the full extent of his debts until after his death from fever, she learned quickly that grief offered no protection from men who wanted their money. The town's moneylender, a heavy-set man named Garrett Voss, had sent his hired hands to collect 3 times already. Each time, Sarah had offered what little she had. Each time, it wasn't enough. This time, Voss himself had ridden into town, sitting high on his horse while his men held Sarah down and stripped the shawl from her back. The whip was for show, he said loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, a lesson to anyone else who thought they could die owing him money and leave their families to dodge the debt. Sarah's son, Daniel, tried to run to her, but one of the men shoved him hard enough that he fell against a hitching post, blood trickling from his temple. The crowd watched. Nobody moved. Fear had a way of making good people stand very still. That was when the stranger appeared at the end of the street, his horse walking slow and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world despite what was unfolding before him. He wore a duster coat gray with trail dust, and his hat was pulled low enough that most of his face stayed in shadow. Nobody in Cedar Ridge knew his name. He had ridden in only that morning, taken a room at the boarding house, and said nothing to anyone. But when the second lash came down toward Sarah's back, his voice cut through the street louder than the whip itself. He said the word, enough, only once, but something in the way he said it made every head turn, made even Voss's men pause with their hands still raised. The stranger dismounted without hurry, and as he walked forward, the crowd parted instinctively, the way people do when they sense something dangerous approaching, something they don't yet understand but know enough to fear. Voss, sitting on his horse, sneered down at the newcomer and asked who in the hell he thought he was, interrupting a man's business in the middle of the street. The stranger didn't answer right away. He knelt instead beside Sarah, helped her sit up, and looked at the angry whelp forming across her shoulder with an expression that flickered, just for a moment, with something like old pain, something that suggested he had seen cruelty like this before and had never learned to make peace with it. He rose to his feet slowly, dust falling from his knees, and told Voss that whatever debt a dead man owed didn't transfer onto the back of his widow, not in any court, not in any decent town, and not while he was standing there breathing. Voss laughed, waving his hand toward his 3 hired men, telling the stranger that this wasn't his town and wasn't his business, and that he'd best mount up and ride on before he found himself in a grave next to the fool who started this debt in the first place. What happened next unfolded in seconds, though it would be talked about in Cedar Ridge for years afterward. One of Voss's men reached for his sidearm, thinking the stranger's calm was weakness rather than what it truly was, which was control. The stranger's hand moved with a speed that seemed almost unnatural, and his shot struck the man's gun clean out of his grip before he'd even cleared leather. The crack of the shot echoed down the street, and in the silence that followed, the stranger informed the remaining men that the next bullet wouldn't be so polite. Voss's face had gone pale, his bravado draining out of him as quickly as the color from his cheeks. He tried to argue that this was lawful business, that debts were debts and the law protected creditors, but the stranger reminded him, in a voice that had gone quiet and dangerous, that no law in any territory permitted horsewhipping a grieving widow in the street, and that if Voss wanted to test that claim, he was welcome to ride to the territorial marshal and explain himself, though the stranger doubted Voss would enjoy explaining why half the town had watched him do it. The onlookers, emboldened now by the stranger's defiance, began murmuring among themselves, and an older woman near the front finally found her voice, saying loudly that she'd seen the whole thing and would testify to what Voss had done if it came to that. Others nodded. The tide of fear that had held the town silent was shifting, and Voss could feel it turning against him as surely as the stranger's pistol was still raised in warning. Sarah, still trembling, watched this unfold with tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her face. Daniel had crawled to her side, holding her hand, and together they watched a stranger they had never met risk his life for people he owed nothing to. It was the kind of moment that changes a person's understanding of the world, the realization that mercy could still exist even in a place that had seemed to forget it entirely. Voss, seeing his men unwilling to draw against a man who had already proven faster and surer than any of them, finally relented. He spat in the dirt, told the stranger this wasn't finished, and rode off with his men trailing behind him, their earlier swagger replaced with the hurried shame of men who had been publicly humbled. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some offering Sarah quiet words of comfort they hadn't dared speak minutes before, others simply relieved that violence had passed them by once again. The stranger helped Sarah to her feet, retrieved her shawl from the dirt, and placed it gently over her shoulders. He introduced himself simply as Cole, offering no last name, no explanation of where he'd come from or why he'd chosen that morning to ride into Cedar Ridge. He told her that he'd once had a sister who faced something similar, and that he'd arrived too late to help her, a confession that seemed to cost him something to share. He said he didn't intend to make the same mistake twice. Over the following days, Cole stayed in Cedar Ridge longer than he'd planned. He helped Sarah repair the fence around her small property, taught Daniel how to properly care for a horse, and slowly, the townsfolk who had once stood frozen in fear began treating Sarah with a warmth they'd withheld before, as though Cole's courage had reminded them of their own capacity for decency. Voss never returned to collect his debt, word having spread that the marshal's office had taken quiet interest in his methods, and within a month, he'd left the territory altogether, his reputation in ruins. Cole eventually rode on, as men like him always do, but not before Sarah thanked him with a simple embrace and a promise that Daniel would remember him as the reason he still believed good men existed in this hard world. She never saw him again. Those stories drifted back over the years of a lone gunslinger who seemed to appear wherever cruelty threatened the powerless, disappearing again once justice had been restored. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment letting us know what part moved you most. Your support means everything to this channel and helps us keep bringing you stories of courage, kindness, and hope. Before we close this chapter, we'd love for you to comment the word justice below if you believe kindness should always stand up against cruelty, no matter the cost. Sarah Mitchell rebuilt her life in Cedar Ridge, raising Daniel to be a man of both strength and compassion, often telling him the story of the stranger who taught them that mercy sometimes rides in wearing a duster coat and carrying a Colt revolver, arriving exactly when the world needs it most, asking for nothing in return but the simple satisfaction of doing what was right.